Chapter 1, Outdoor Streamer. My name is Zhang Lin. I'm 25, from the north. After graduating, I found myself drifting aimlessly. I tried everything, delivering food, sales, real estate, even starting small businesses. But no matter what I did, I never made any real money. Feeling lost, I decided to leave my hometown and head south, hoping for a fresh start. It was by pure chance that I stumbled into the world of live streaming. Now, I'm an outdoor content creator with over 200,000 followers on a certain platform. I scrape by on sporadic traffic and donations, but it's enough to get by. My content mainly revolves around island challenges, wilderness survival, and living off the land. I say survival, but it's really more like a well-planned adventure. I pack loads of food and gear, and head to some pre-selected locations, basically a vacation. Sometimes, I even team up with other streamers. They film on one side of the island, and I film on the other. After shooting, we set up folding chairs, crack open some beers, cast our fishing lines, and enjoy the sea breeze. Life doesn't get much better than that. Along the way, I've learned some basic outdoor skills, building shelters, setting traps for small animals, weaving baskets, filtering water, foraging, and cooking. My cooking, in particular, has improved a lot. I can now grill mantises, grasshoppers, fish, shrimp, crabs, and even roast sweet potatoes and yams. I've even gotten pretty good at making roast mouse taste decent. I sometimes joke that I'm now a top-tier barbecue master and daydream about opening a barbecue joint. Business would surely be booming. Aside from my cooking, my time outdoors has given me a decent knowledge of survival skills. To improve my content, I often watch survival videos from experts, both domestic and international, like Bear Grylls, the guy who claims everything tastes like chicken, Starving Ed, who seems to start every challenge hungry, and the tough but silent Aussie guy. I've watched almost all their videos. From them, I've learned a lot: survival techniques, the climates and ecosystems of different regions, how to identify plants, and how to adapt to varying rainfall patterns and animal behaviors. But there's one skill that continues to elude me: starting a fire with sticks. Nowadays, it seems every outdoor streamer shows off their ability to start fires with nothing but sticks. But only those who've actually tried it know how hard it really is. I once spent 2 hours rubbing sticks together until my hands were blistered, and still didn't even see a spark. In the end, I had to cheat for the sake of the video, using a lighter and some clever editing. My arms were sore for days after that. So, I'm pretty sure that only a handful of streamers can actually pull off starting a fire with sticks in real life. Recently, though, I've hit a creative slump. I've conquered rainforests, mountains, islands, even deserts. The routine has become predictable: build a shelter, find food, show off survival techniques. After so many videos, it's hard to stay excited, and it's showing. My follower count has plateaued, and views have been lackluster. I've been stuck, scrolling through other streamers' content, hoping to find some inspiration or fresh filming locations. On May 16, 2015, I woke up late, as usual. A sudden thunderclap shook me awake, and I looked outside. It was pouring rain. No chance of heading out today. After a quick wash, I heated up some bread and milk, and started mindlessly scrolling through my phone while I ate. Suddenly, a post titled, 30-Day Island Challenge, caught my eye. The post went something like this: the show is inviting outdoor enthusiasts from all walks of life to participate in a real wilderness survival challenge. The location will be selected by the show's producers, and participants can choose 3 survival tools from a provided list. The exact location is undisclosed. Participants will be gathered and transported to the site for a 30-day survival challenge. Those who complete the challenge will receive a prize of 150,000 yuan. Each contestant will be provided with a satellite phone for emergency contact, ensuring safety. For application details, see the link below. A windfall, I thought, nearly choking on my milk. This seemed like a gift from the heavens. The producers would handle the location, I'd get to pick 3 survival tools, and there'd even be a safety net. If I had to prepare for this on my own, it would cost me both time and money. Now, not only would I get everything for free, but I could film fresh content, and if I succeeded, I'd walk away with 150,000 yuan. I dropped my bread and milk, quickly filled out the application, name, gender, age, height, weight, and contact info, and already started mentally spending that prize money. I was over the moon, thinking this was an easy 150,000 yuan, practically in the bag. Little did I know, this seemingly random decision would change my life forever, and nearly cost me my life. If I could go back, I'd never sign up for that show, but, unfortunately, life doesn't come with a reset button. Chapter 2, Wilderness Survival Challenge. The week leading up to the challenge was intense. Each day began with physical training, followed by a review of outdoor knowledge and survival skills. Yet, despite my preparations, I hadn't heard a word from the production team since registering. I scoured the internet for any additional information, but aside from the initial announcement, nothing else surfaced. I didn't even know who the organizers or investors were, which left me questioning the competition's legitimacy. Just as I began to feel disappointed and suspect this was merely a publicity stunt, my phone rang. A staff member from the production team was on the line, informing me of the meeting location and time for the contestants. Coincidentally, the gathering point was in Sanya, so all I needed to do was pack my personal belongings and be ready to meet in 3 days. The morning of the third day arrived quickly. I jumped out of bed, dressed in a hurry, and had a quick breakfast. I packed 3 vests, 2 pairs of shorts, and a sturdy pair of jungle boots before heading out. The summer heat in Hainan was oppressive, with temperatures soaring to around 32 degrees Celsius. It was about 40 kilometers from my home to the meeting point, so I called a ride-share. The driver was quite talkative, and our pleasant conversation made the trip feel shorter than it was. An hour later, I arrived at the meeting point, a hotel on Hepping Street, conveniently close to the harbor, likely our departure point. After calling the production team, a young man soon appeared to greet me. Inside the hotel, I was struck by the sight of over 20 contestants gathered in a business room, enthusiastically discussing their plans, with some even claiming they were there for a vacation. I found a chair and surveyed the other contestants. Most were men aged 30 to 40, but there were a few women as well, 2 of whom were strikingly attractive and fit. Among them was an older gentleman, seemingly in his 60s, with graying hair, animatedly chatting with others. Next to me sat a younger guy who looked lean yet strong, with dark skin that radiated authenticity. After a brief chat, I learned his name was Zhe Yao, a 20-year-old from Qingdao, here to take on the challenge for the prize money. About 20 minutes later, all the contestants had arrived, bringing our total to 34 participants. 3 staff members then entered to explain the competition details and rules. I discovered that our challenge locations wouldn't be on the same island. Instead, we would be sent to several uninhabited small islands along the same latitude. These islands had access to freshwater sources and some food resources. Each contestant would be transported to their designated spot by separate fishing boats and provided with 2 packs of compressed food, 500 grams, a bottle of water, 350 milliliters, and a first aid kit. For safety, each participant would carry a satellite phone, allowing us to call for help at any time if we felt unsafe, ensuring prompt medical assistance. Despite these precautions, certain risks remained, such as encounters with ferocious wildlife. Consequently, everyone was required to sign contracts and insurance waivers. At this point, 3 contestants opted to withdraw, but I was resolute in my decision to continue. After signing the necessary documents, we moved on to the tool selection process. The production team handed each of us a list of tools, asking us to choose 3, and granted us half an hour to consider our options. I carefully examined the extensive tool list, which included items such as a small axe, hand saw, dagger, small shovel, wire saw, 5 liters of bottled water, 1 kilogram of compressed food, 3 fish hooks, 10 meters of fishing line, flashlight, compound bow and arrow, umbrella, tent, compass, box of matches, magnesium blocks, candles, binder clips, binoculars, sleeping bag, water filtration straw, gloves, medical tape, sulfur powder, fine wire, waterproof watch, thermos, and sewing kit. Initially, I wondered why selecting just 3 tools would take so long, but as I scrutinized the lengthy list, I quickly grasped the challenge. Picking 3 items from such a vast array of choices was incredibly difficult. Each item seemed useful, leaving me feeling torn between my selections. I began to reflect on my outdoor experiences. The three essential elements of wilderness survival are shelter, water, food, and a means to create fire. For shelter, I would need branches and wood, making the axe my top choice. Not only could it chop, but it could also dig and serve as a makeshift dagger. As for fire starting, I had no intention of attempting the friction method again. In the wild, with damp and unpredictable weather, friction fire starting is labor-intensive and unreliable. Thus, I chose the magnesium block. Regarding water and food, the production team had already supplied 2 packs of compressed food and a bottle of water, which I believed would be sufficient until I could find fresh water and food sources. Therefore, for my third tool, I opted for a small bundle of wire, which I had my own plans for. The half-hour quickly slipped away, and everyone made their selections within the allotted time. After confirming our choices, the production team informed us we could rest at the hotel for the night and that we would depart at 6 the following morning. We returned to our rooms, and after dinner, we mentally prepared for the challenges awaiting us the next day. Chapter 3, Departure. I hardly slept last night. My mind was consumed with memories of past outdoor experiences as I tried to devise a survival strategy for when I reached my destination. For some reason, an undercurrent of unease lingered within me. It wasn't until around 3 in the morning that I finally managed to drift off. Looking back now, I wonder if that was a warning from fate, hinting that I shouldn't continue with this challenge. Unfortunately, I was oblivious to it at the time. At 5:30 in the morning, my alarm rang, cutting through the silence. After a quick wash and breakfast, I headed to the lobby for the assembly. The atmosphere was charged with enthusiasm, almost all the contestants had arrived. I spotted Jay Yao in the crowd and greeted him. He acknowledged me with a slight nod. At 6 o'clock sharp, the production team arrived as promised. We boarded a bus that took us to the yacht harbor on Nangong Alley. Each of us was assigned to a fishing boat larger than any I had ever ridden. It was a 24-meter steel trawler. We were unaware of the exact location of the challenge, but the team leader mentioned we would need to sail for about a week. I didn't think much of it. Due to the harbor's limited capacity, we were divided into 6 batches. Jay Yao and I were scheduled in the last batch. When it was finally our turn, I boarded the boat, where 3 others were already present: Captain Wang, who was 45, his first mate, Liu, aged 34, and a production staff member named Gao Deming, around 30 and notably tall. Gao handed me a black backpack containing a small axe, a magnesium block, a satellite phone, a first aid kit, a bundle of wire, 2 packs of compressed food, and a bottle of mineral water. After thanking him, I tried to engage in conversation, but didn't glean any more useful information about the challenge. As the fishing boat left the harbor, its speed gradually increased. At first, I could still see a few other contestants' boats, but soon only Jay Yao's vessel remained in view, and by the afternoon, even it faded into the distance. I sat on the deck, enjoying the sea breeze and feeling surprisingly comfortable. First mate Liu was at the helm while Gao stood nearby, watching with curiosity. I offered Captain Wang a cigarette and struck up a conversation about his past sailing experiences. Captain Wang's heavy local accent made his speech difficult to decipher at times, but I could sense his deep reverence for the sea. He mentioned that before every voyage, he would pay respects to the Dragon King, praying for safe travels and a bountiful catch. Perhaps the Dragon King had indeed shown favor, as he had navigated him through numerous perilous situations. Listening to him, I didn't feel overly concerned. My upbringing had instilled in me a stronger belief in science. Now it was the morning of the 5th day of our journey. The skies had been clear, with not a cloud in sight for days. I had lost all sense of direction, surrounded only by the endless deep blue sea. That morning, I didn't see any other boats. The only sounds were the crashing waves and the engine's roar, which left me feeling somewhat anxious. Captain Wang continued to smile at me, seemingly aware of my unease. In his dialect, he reassured me, "Don't worry, kid, I've been sailing for over 30 years, and I've seen it all. Just relax." His words helped ease my tension as I gazed at the distant horizon, hoping to spot another boat to accompany us. Considering the captain's extensive experience in the calm sea, my anxiety gradually dissipated. However, by the afternoon, despite the sunny weather, I still couldn't see any other boats. A gentle breeze began to stir, providing a cool and pleasant sensation against my skin. But then, I noticed. Captain Wang's expression shifted from calm to serious, then to one of concern. He informed us that the air was thick with moisture, and it seemed the weather might change in the coming days. Captain Wang suggested we turn back immediately or find the nearest port to wait it out. However, after discussing it with the production team, they disagreed, insisting that we couldn't afford to delay and that the weather forecast indicated no heavy rain in the near future, just overcast skies. After promising to double his payment, the production team managed to persuade Captain Wang to continue. His earlier smile vanished, and he ordered the first mate to increase the engine power and speed toward our destination. Though hesitant about returning, I was reluctant to give up before the challenge even began. The weather still seemed relatively calm, so I kept my concerns to myself, remaining seated on the deck, staring at the distant horizon. As evening approached, the sun had dipped 2/3 below the horizon, and the fiery clouds painted the sky as if it were ablaze. Just then, I suddenly spotted a patch of black clouds on the western horizon, looming like a swarm of crows descending upon us, filling me with a sense of foreboding. When Captain Wang saw those black clouds, a look of terror flashed across his wrinkled face. Chapter 4, The Nightmare Arrives. Defu, southwest. Turn the helm all the way. Step on the gas. Captain Wang sprinted toward the control cabin, his arms flailing as he shouted at First Mate Liu, as if he had spotted a monstrous creature up ahead. Zhe Yao and I exchanged glances, a wave of dread washing over us. If the usually composed Captain Wang was in such a state, something serious was clearly afoot. We hurried into the control cabin, trying to ask what was happening. The captain and Liu were frantically maneuvering the boat, shouting to each other in a dialect I couldn't understand. It wasn't until Gao Deming forcefully grabbed Captain Wang's arm that he calmed down enough to hurriedly explain, "A major storm is approaching from the northeast. It will hit us by late tonight at the latest. Once we're caught in it, there's no escape." With that, the captain rushed out again. At that moment, my mind went blank, panic gripping me as I stood frozen like a computer that had crashed. It was only when Gao patted my shoulder and said, "Let's go help the captain," that I felt a flicker of resolve. We quickly ran to the deck and saw the captain pulling out some orange and white circular life rings from a large box. Upon seeing us, he shouted, "Quick! Inflate these life rings and tie them to the side." Zhe Yao and I immediately split the tasks, one to inflate, the other to drag. There were a total of 8 life rings, made of canvas, each about 3 meters in diameter. Once inflated, they were incredibly heavy and nearly impossible to move alone. It took the 3 of us nearly an hour to secure all 8 large life rings to the side of the boat. During this time, Captain Wang lowered the mast at the bow, securely fastening it to the deck with ropes and tying down all movable items. Every window was reinforced with burlap. Once everything was secured, the captain pulled out an inflatable kayak from the cargo hold. After inflating it, he told us that this kayak might be our last line of survival. After nearly 4 hours of frantic work, we finally completed our preparations. Captain Wang appeared a bit calmer, sitting on the deck and silently watching the increasingly close black clouds. Although still far away, they exuded an oppressive aura. At this moment, I still didn't grasp the severity of the situation. It was still bright, and while the waves were a bit larger than usual, it didn't seem like a cause for alarm. Naively, I asked the captain, "At our current speed and distance, can the storm really catch up? Besides, our boat isn't small, a bit of wind and waves shouldn't be a problem, right?" Captain Wang didn't look at me, he continued to stare at the black clouds, his voice low. "Don't underestimate it. Although it looks far away, it moves frighteningly fast and will catch up to us tonight. Storms at sea are nothing like those on land. There are no sturdy buildings out here, any issue with the boat could be fatal." With that, he got up to check the equipment on the ship. At this point, I had completely lost interest in the island challenge, even the prize money of 150,000 seemed irrelevant. Yet, I wasn't panicking, the sky was still bright, and the sea breeze felt cool against my skin. I thought perhaps this would just be an exhilarating experience and wouldn't pose any danger to life. Gao Deming informed me that he had called for help from the production team, but they responded that they couldn't arrive immediately and reassured us there wasn't much danger, asking us to stay calm. However, 2 hours passed, and the wind at sea had gradually shifted from a gentle breeze to a brisk gust, bringing with it a chill. The waves began to swell, and the boat started to rock violently. I thought to myself that the storm was indeed coming. At this time, Captain Wang and First Mate Lu were intently controlling the boat in the cabin, while Zhe Yao and I retreated to the passenger cabin. An hour later, darkness enveloped the sky, and the sea was pitch black, with the wind and waves raging. Even while staying in the cabin, I could hear the howling wind whipping past the hull, producing a piercing, whoo, sound. Each wave was higher than the last, crashing against the ship as if trying to tear it apart, the splashes obscuring the sky. Our boat bobbed violently in the giant waves, resembling my racing heart. I could no longer hear the engine's sound, it had been completely drowned out by the roar of the wind and waves. At this moment, everything around me, both sound and sight, was filled with the fury of the storm. I was utterly panicked, enveloped by a deep-seated fear that made me tremble uncontrollably. God, I didn't know how much time had passed. Maybe 5 minutes, maybe 5 hours, but outside, it was completely dark, and I could see nothing. Through the violent swaying of the ship and the howling wind, I realized that the storm was in full force, and we were likely at the storm's center. The boat swayed violently, I could barely stand or sit. I even heard the hull creaking ominously, as if it could be torn apart at any moment. The howling wind outside sounded like a pack of hungry wolves, echoing in my ears with a haunting intensity. Heavy rain fell in torrents, and the giant waves relentlessly battered the hull. I finally understood Captain Wang's earlier panic. My entire body felt cold, my face pale, I no longer sensed my existence, as if my soul had been ripped apart by the storm. I could only mechanically pray in my mind, hoping for protection. The sheer terror of that moment is something I still cannot bear to recall. I don't know how long it had been when the cabin door was suddenly pounded on violently. I jolted, trembling as I opened the door to find Captain Wang in a raincoat, holding a flashlight. He said nothing more, urgently shouting, "The boat is damaged. We're taking on water. We won't hold out much longer. Quickly, get on the kayak." Chapter 5, Desperate Escape. A tremendous sense of fear rendered my body rigid as stone, my mind blank, as if my soul had left my body. I couldn't move for what felt like an eternity. It wasn't until Gao Deming leaned in halfway from outside the door and shouted at me again that my consciousness returned. I hurriedly ran outside. Just as I reached the doorway, I suddenly turned back, grabbed my backpack from the bed, and then stumbled out of the cabin. I struggled up the stairs to the deck, and as soon as I poked my head out, a biting sea breeze sent me staggering. How could the wind be so cold in summer? The torrential rain pelted my face like needles, making it impossible to fully open my eyes. I could only squint, barely leaving a small gap. The boat pitched violently in the enormous waves, and I couldn't walk upright at all. I had to bend over, propping myself on the deck with one hand just to stay on my feet. In the weak light of a flashlight, I saw Captain Wang and Gao Deming struggling to drag the inflatable kayak to the stern. I crawled over to them bit by bit. As I approached to help, Captain Wang suddenly shoved me and shouted, "Go get Defu." I glanced back at the control cabin and, through the yellow light, vaguely saw First Mate Lu's figure. Grabbing a rope on the deck, I slowly crawled toward the control cabin and kicked open the wooden door. First Mate Lu was focused intently on steering the boat and didn't even notice me. I stumbled forward, hugged him tightly, and shouted in his ear, "The captain wants you to go. Follow me." He glanced at me, surveyed the control cabin, then sighed and crawled behind me toward the stern. When we arrived, Captain Wang and Gao Deming had already pushed the kayak to the side of the ship. It was a black inflatable boat, capable of seating 5 or 6 people, and once inflated, it was quite heavy, with 2 life rings tied to its side that had been removed from the ship. It took all 4 of us working together to push the kayak into the sea. At that moment, the hold of the fishing boat was already flooded with water, tilting the hull by 30 degrees. We had to hold tightly onto the ropes to avoid being thrown into the sea. Captain Wang and First Mate Lu worked to stabilize the ship while pulling the kayak's rope to secure it tightly to the large vessel, trying to minimize the kayak swaying and signaling for me and Gao Deming to board first. Gao Deming wasted no time and quickly jumped onto the kayak, crouching down. However, I hesitated, feeling scared and concerned for Captain Wang and First Mate Lu. I looked back at them and saw the 2 shouting at me, but the howling wind drowned out their words. They were probably urging me to hurry aboard. I gritted my teeth, made up my mind, aimed for the kayak, and jumped with all my might. But I lost my balance upon landing and almost fell into the sea. At the critical moment, Gao Deming caught me just in time, otherwise, I would have been swept away by the waves. Before I could gather my wits, First Mate Lu jumped down as well, nearly crashing into me. This meant Captain Wang hadn't boarded yet. The three of us anxiously searched for his figure, only to see him still standing at the stern, holding onto the railing like an old tree in a storm, swaying precariously in the fierce wind but showing no sign of retreat. My heart tightened. It seemed Captain Wang had no intention of coming down. Had he given up hope for survival? Or was he determined to go down with the ship, thinking we couldn't escape anyway, and that our struggles were futile? We shouted desperately, signaling for the captain to jump down quickly. First Mate Lu frantically waved his hands, yelling at the captain. If it weren't for Gao Deming and me holding him back, he might have rushed back to the boat, trying to pull Captain Wang to safety. But in such a storm, that could easily lead to him being swallowed by the waves. Captain Wang merely waved at us and turned to walk toward the center of the deck. Moments later, the rope connecting the kayak was untied, and the kayak was instantly swept away like a kite with its string cut, quickly carried off by the fierce wind. The situation had reached a critical point, and I could no longer think of anyone else. The wind and rain battered my face, painful as needles, making it almost impossible to keep my eyes open. I gripped the handrail of the kayak tightly, my whole body sprawled on the boat, as if lying on an out-of-control glider, moving rapidly, bobbing up and down, at risk of being thrown off at any moment. The waves continuously struck the kayak and my back, and I was terrified, fearing the small boat would be swallowed by the waves. However, this type of kayak had excellent buoyancy. Even if it was submerged by the waves, it would quickly resurface. The only thing I had to worry about was not being thrown into the sea by inertia. I clung tightly to the kayak because it was my only lifeline, my only hope for survival. Adrenaline surged through me, and although I couldn't see anything clearly, I kept my eyes wide open, terrified that if I closed them, I might never see this world again. After a long time of tension, my hands and feet began to tremble, and the soreness turned to numbness, but I couldn't relax for a moment. The slightest let-up could mean being mercilessly dragged into the depths of the sea, becoming a meal for fish. I had no idea how Gao Deming and First Mate Lu were faring, but they were experienced and should be much better off than me. The storm continued for a long time, and our kayak was blown far away, and I had no idea how far. It wasn't until around dawn that the wind finally eased slightly. I had gone from the initial soreness to nearly losing consciousness, yet I still didn't relax even a little. That night became a nightmare I could never shake off in my life. For countless nights to come, this scene would wake me from my dreams. Chapter 6, Drift Diary. The storm raged on until the early hours of the morning, and my instincts kicked in, forcing me to cling to the small boat for dear life. Honestly, I don't know how I made it through. The dinghy rocked violently, leaving me dizzy and nauseous. I ended up collapsing, heaving uncontrollably. Having eaten nothing the night before, all I could do was dry heave until there was nothing left. As dawn broke, the sea finally calmed. The rain ceased, and the wind turned soft. It felt like I'd just survived a terrible hangover, my body aching, exhausted, but unable to sleep. At some point, fatigue took over, and I passed out. Whether I actually slept or lost consciousness, I couldn't tell. I don't know how long I was out, but I woke up to the blinding glare of the sun. I opened my eyes to see the vast blue sky, and for a fleeting moment, I forgot where I was. My body was heavy with fatigue and soreness, making it hard to move. The events of last night came rushing back to me. I shot up, and across from me, Gao Deming sat staring blankly, his eyes empty. He didn't say a word. We locked eyes for about 30 seconds, neither of us knowing what to say. Suddenly, I realized something was wrong. First Mate Lu had been with us last night, where was he now? Panicked, I asked Gao, "Where's Lu? Where did he go?" Gao remained dazed, and just as I started to fear he'd lost his mind, he finally muttered, "He's gone." Gone? How? I saw him jump into the boat right next to me. I couldn't believe it. If I'd survived, how could First Mate Lu not have? Gao Deming lowered his voice. He broke his arm last night while pulling ropes on the main boat. It was tossing too hard, and he couldn't hold on. The waves took him. I froze. Last night, I was so focused on myself that I hadn't noticed what had happened to him. If I had, maybe I could have helped. Guilt surged through me, but then I thought, could I really have done anything in that situation? Either way, it was too late now. Reflecting on Captain Wang's and First Mate Lu's fate, I couldn't help but sob. I cried not just for them but for the hopelessness of our situation. We drifted aimlessly, our inflatable kayak at the mercy of the waves. There was nothing but endless water in every direction. Worse, we had no paddles, they had been lost when we hit the water. I searched my bag and found that the satellite phone had been ruined by water. All we had were 2 packs of compressed rations and a single bottle of water. Gao Deming had brought nothing. Staring out at the vast ocean, neither of us knew how long we'd be drifting. I handed 1 pack of rations to Gao, and we each ate half a piece. These military-style compressed rations were filling, but they left our mouths dry. We each drank a sip of water, and soon, we had only half a bottle left. You can go days without food, but without water, you're dead in 3. The gravity of our situation weighed heavily on us. If we didn't reach land or get rescued in the next few days, we'd die of thirst. By the 3rd day, the water was gone, and our lips had turned white and chapped. I had 1 small piece of ration left but couldn't bring myself to eat it, while Gao had finished his. Even though we were starving and dehydrated, we didn't fight. We both knew arguing would only quicken our demise. On the 4th day, the relentless sun continued to beat down. I was so thirsty, I began to see black spots. Out of desperation, we drank our own urine. It was revolting, but it was the only liquid we had left. Worse, Gao began to develop a fever, his face flushed and burning with heat. We had no medicine, no food, and no water. I gave him the last bit of my ration, but by then, I was too weak to move. On the morning of the 5th day, the air finally cooled, but Gao had slipped into a coma. His flushed skin had paled, and his breathing was shallow. I was desperate, but there was nothing I could do. I, too, felt like I was on the verge of collapsing. On the 6th day, the sky darkened unexpectedly, and by noon, it started to drizzle. I was overjoyed, opening my mouth to let the rain quench my cracked throat. This rain was a miracle. I grabbed the bottle and tried to collect as much water as I could. Using my axe, I widened the bottle's opening to catch more rain. Gao barely opened his eyes and told me he wasn't going to make it. He started to give me his last words, telling me he lived in Jinshui District, Zhengzhou, Henan Province, and begged me to pass on a message to his family. His words broke my heart, but there was nothing I could do. Over the past 6 days, we hadn't seen a single ship or even the shadow of an island. I didn't know how much longer I could last. In my despair, I wondered who I would leave my last words to if Gao died. Just when all hope seemed lost, I caught a glimpse of something in the distance, land. I screamed in excitement, "Gao! Look, an island!" For a moment, I felt like we might survive. But as I turned back to Gao, I saw that he was no longer responsive. I rushed over to him and found his breathing faint. I knew I had to reach that island quickly, find water, food, maybe even a way to save him. Summoning every ounce of strength I had left, I began paddling towards the island, using my hands and feet to push the kayak forward. Chapter 7: First Steps on the Island. I spent the entire afternoon paddling with nothing but my hands and feet, no tools to help. From a distance, the island seemed so close, yet in reality, it was still far off. I pushed myself hard for hours, my arms and legs growing sore and numb. As dusk approached, I had no choice but to stop and rest. I took a small sip from the nearly empty water bottle and glanced at Gao Deming, who was still unconscious. He hadn't woken up, and I was too afraid to check if he was breathing, terrified of confirming the worst. Earlier that afternoon, I had tried to give him some water. At first, he weakly opened his mouth, but soon the water just dribbled out. Deep down, I knew he wasn't going to make it. Sadness swept over me. From Captain Wang and First Mate Lu to now Gao Deming, the 4 of us had set out together, but now I was the only one left, fighting to survive. The fragility of life felt overwhelming. My thoughts drifted to Zhe Yao. We had been heading in the same direction. Was he caught in the storm too? If so, was he still alive? And where were the other contestants? As night fell, I looked again at Gao Deming, but he remained unresponsive. My stomach growled with hunger, but I had no energy left. I decided to rest for the night and continue paddling in the morning. The next morning, the 7th day, I woke with a bit of strength restored after some much-needed rest. When I looked toward the island, I was thrilled to see that drifting through the night had brought me closer. The wind was pushing me toward the shore, and I could make out the rocks near the island. At last, it seemed like luck was on my side. I started paddling again, slowly but surely making progress. After most of the day, I found myself within 500 meters of the island, my spirits lifting. 2 hours later, as the sun began to set, I finally saw barnacles clinging to the rocks. I pushed the kayak into the shallows just as darkness began to creep in. Jumping out of the boat, my legs nearly gave out from under me, and I almost fell. The seawater reached my chest as I strained to drag the kayak toward the beach. When my feet finally touched solid ground, I collapsed onto the sand, crying out loud, letting go of all the fear and frustration I had bottled up for days. For half an hour, I sobbed until I had no more tears left. When the tears stopped, new fears began to surface. Were there wild animals on this island? What dangers could be hiding here? I missed home, missed my family, wondering if they even knew what had happened to me. As my thoughts cleared, I realized I had to focus on survival, on how to get off this island. Judging by the direction I had drifted from Sanya, I figured this island wasn't in Chinese waters anymore. I could be somewhere near Australia, but I had no idea for sure. With night closing in, I glanced at Gao Deming's body. The kayak was beached now, but I couldn't move it any further. I would have to bury him in the morning and find a way to fix the kayak. As the last bit of daylight faded, I surveyed the area. The beach stretched endlessly, with only a few scattered coconut trees. In the distance, steep cliffs loomed, their tops brown with rock and their bases dark and jagged with sharp black stones. The forest beyond the cliffs filled me with dread, as if something dangerous lay hidden within. Tonight, I needed fire. Fire would keep the wild animals away. I gathered dry grass and branches, nervously chopping down a few more as I felt unseen eyes watching me from the dark. Back on the beach, I used my magnesium block to spark the grass, and the fire instantly brought me a sense of safety. I stripped off my wet clothes and hung them on some branches to dry. Sitting by the fire, I finally felt a little calmer. The waves crashed against the rocks in the background, and the fire crackled softly. As drowsiness crept in, I added more wood to the flames. Curling up beside the fire, I slowly drifted off to sleep. Chapter 8, A New Life. After days of relentless stress, I finally found a brief respite. My body, utterly drained, sank into a sleep deeper than I'd ever known. When I slowly opened my eyes at dawn, the first thing I saw was the bright blue sky overhead. The fire had gone out, and in the daylight, the island no longer seemed so hostile. The lush greenery now appeared full of life, its menacing nighttime shadows replaced with an almost tranquil beauty. I glanced at the inflatable kayak, now gently rocked by the rising tide, and my heart grew heavy. It was time to deal with Lao Gao's remains. Using thick branches and my axe, I spent about 2 hours digging a large pit where the grass met the beach. Then, with a heavy heart, I carried Lao Gao off the kayak and laid him in front of the pit. After straightening his clothes, I whispered a simple prayer. In a low voice, I promised, if I make it back alive, I'll find your family in Henan and deliver your last words. Rest in peace, Lao Gao. I covered him with earth, forming a small mound, then cut a 1-meter stick and carved his name and the date of his death onto it. In that moment, I truly accepted the harsh reality, those still living must carry on. I didn't allow myself to be swallowed by grief. I wasn't sure how long I could even survive myself. All I could do now was take it one step at a time and leave the rest to fate. From that point forward, my new life on the island began. With Lao Gao buried, I shifted my focus to the days ahead. It was clear I wouldn't be leaving the island anytime soon. The kayak was damaged beyond repair after hitting the reef, and the terrifying weather at sea had shaken my resolve to leave right away. I decided it was safer to stay put, hoping I might spot a passing ship or plane. If rescue seemed unlikely after some time, I'd reconsider trying to leave. Having made this decision, I turned my attention to finding food. I hadn't eaten in days, and while hunger had dulled, I knew I needed to regain my strength. I began foraging along the shore. The rocks on the right side of the beach were covered in shellfish. Even at high tide, many of the rocks remained exposed. Armed with a plastic water bottle and my axe, I carefully navigated between the sharp rocks. My shoes stayed on to avoid cutting my feet on the jagged shells. To my relief, this area was rich in resources. Oysters clung to the rocks, some of them larger than my hand, and crabs scuttled in the crevices. In just 20 minutes, I collected 6 large oysters, 2 crabs, a fist-sized conch, and 2 spiny sea urchins. I wasn't sure what kind of sea urchin they were, but I recalled eating similar ones before. They were delicious. I stuffed the oysters into my pockets, placed the conch and sea urchins in the bottle, and threaded the crabs onto a stick to avoid their claws. Eager to feast on the seafood, I quickly gathered dry grass and firewood, using my magnesium block to start a fire. I was weak, and I feared raw food might upset my stomach, so I made sure to cook everything thoroughly. I roasted the oysters and placed the crabs further from the flames to avoid burning them. As the scent of roasting seafood filled the air, I grabbed an oyster and took a bite. The tender, sweet meat was a burst of pure bliss on my tongue. After devouring the oysters, I cracked open a sea urchin, savoring its rich roe. 6 oysters and 2 sea urchins later, I turned to the crabs. They weren't particularly fat, but they were still a satisfying meal. I finished the crabs and then tackled the conch, carefully removing the bitter gall before chewing on the tender meat. It was delicious, even without seasoning. After the meal, both my body and mind felt replenished. The island's resources were abundant, perhaps, because it was untouched by human activity. The seafood was large and plump, and the beach was pristine, without a trace of ocean trash. However, this isolation also meant my chances of rescue were slim, a sobering thought. With my hunger sated, I began planning for the days ahead. My priority was shelter. Judging by the island's tropical monsoon climate, I knew the rainy season was upon me. I needed to build on higher ground to avoid flooding. I waited for high tide and used a stick to lever the kayak onto the grassy area. I deflated it and stored it in the shade for later use. By the time I finished, the sun was already setting. I packed my backpack, took my axe, and set off to explore the island in search of a place to build my shelter. I hoped to find not only a safe spot to rest but also some wild fruits or fresh water. My throat was parched, I hadn't drunk anything all day. There were a few coconut trees nearby, but I didn't want to waste my energy trying to harvest them just yet. My main concern tonight was finding protection from the wind and rain. Chapter 9, Exploration. I stood at the edge of the terrain, contemplating where to begin my exploration. After careful thought, I decided to start on the island's right side, which I designated as the north. This area was characterized by towering cliffs, scattered rocks, sparse trees, and far fewer wild grasses than the surrounding forest. My instinct told me it was likely the island's highest point. If I could reach the summit, I would be able to survey the entire island and perhaps catch sight of any nearby islands or passing ships. With my plan set, I packed my backpack to hold any wild fruits or food I might find, grabbed a sturdy stick to serve as a hiking staff, and strapped my axe to my waist before setting off. Before long, I arrived at the cliffside, where slippery rocks awaited me. I navigated the stones carefully, ever wary of a potential fall. After covering about 10 meters, an idea struck me. Leaning down, I licked one of the damp rocks and, as I suspected, discovered fresh water. Looking up, I noticed a thin stream of water trickling from a crevice above. To my surprise, I had stumbled upon a freshwater source. Finding a crack where the water flowed more steadily, I pressed my bottle against the rock and began to collect the water. Though the flow was slow, I patiently filled my bottle for 5 minutes before managing to gather a small amount. Taking a sip, the sweet water instantly quenched my thirst. However, since it was untreated, I didn't drink too much, preferring to save it for later as I continued my ascent. As I climbed higher, the path grew steeper and more challenging. The wild grass reached knee-high, making me apprehensive about the possibility of encountering a venomous snake. Gripping my hiking staff tightly, I struck the ground ahead of me as I cautiously advanced. Thankfully, the sparse trees lining the mountainside provided some visibility, though they were few and far between. After climbing for a while, I was delighted to find a small patch of cacti behind a large rock, adorned with purple-red cactus fruit. I carefully plucked one, peeled it, and popped it into my mouth. It was tart with a hint of sweetness, and filled with seeds. Cactus fruit is packed with vitamins, so I gathered a handful, wrapped them in a large leaf, and stored them in my backpack before resuming my climb. About 2 hours into my ascent, I reached roughly a third of the way up. During this time, I had discovered 2 types of wild fruits. One was wild strawberries. I found a single plant and harvested 7 ripe strawberries. Though small, they were delightfully sweet and sour. Initially, I contemplated transplanting the plant down the mountain but ultimately decided against it, fearing failure due to my lack of preparation. The second discovery was a cluster of bananas from the rainforest. The banana trees stood just slightly taller than me, bearing small fruits shorter than my palm. The banana grove extended deep into the forest. I snapped off one tree and gathered a bunch of ripe bananas, leaving the unripe ones behind. I also chopped off a portion of the banana tree's core with my small axe before continuing my climb. After climbing for a while, my legs began to ache, and I was panting heavily, drenched in sweat. The oppressive afternoon heat weighed me down. I glanced upward and realized I still had a long way to go to reach the summit, having barely made it halfway. Looking out at the distant sea, I saw no ships or other islands and recognized that I had overestimated my progress. With only a few hours of daylight left, it was clear I wouldn't reach the summit before dark. I needed to head back down soon. Who knew what kind of dangerous creatures roamed the mountains at night? After a brief rest, I ate 2 bananas. They were soft, sweet, and delicious, despite being filled with seeds. I also drank some of the fresh water I had collected from the spring. As I ascended, I noticed more water trickling from the rock crevices to my right. Some even pooled in small depressions, allowing me to refill my bottle. Just as I was preparing to descend, I spotted a series of small, evenly spaced depressions on the ground, leading from the rocks into the forest. Squatting down to examine the grass, I realized they were animal tracks. The front paw prints were longer with 4 short toes, while the rear footprints were round. I deduced they belonged to a mountain goat. This unexpected discovery excited me. Perhaps I'd soon be feasting on goat meat. Retracing my steps down the mountain took over an hour. Though I hadn't climbed very far, reaching less than halfway, I had made some valuable discoveries. The key takeaway: reaching the summit would require at least a full day, not counting the descent. So, next time I attempted the climb, I needed to be fully prepared for an overnight stay. Glancing at the sun, I estimated it to be around 5 p.m. Suddenly, I remembered the multifunctional sports watch tucked away in my backpack. Thankfully, it was waterproof and still functional. It was now 4:25 p.m., and I recalled that summer days are long. With food for tonight already secured, I decided to build a simple shelter. Sleeping on the ground felt too risky, and I craved a sense of security. I planned to construct my temporary shelter near the rocks, close to the freshwater source. I chose a spot at the boundary between the beach and the grasslands, safe from high tide and distant from the ominous forest. After laying down my gear, I took only my axe and ventured into the woods to gather some wood, selecting small trees about the thickness of my wrist. I cut them into pieces about 1.8 meters long, gathering 19 poles in total. Chopping down small trees was relatively straightforward. After making a notch in the trunk, I simply snapped them. I also cut a few shorter sticks, making several trips to carry everything back. Next, I dug 4 holes in the ground in the shape of a rectangle, placing a pole in each hole and packing the dirt around them. About 10 centimeters off the ground, I tied 2 horizontal poles across the top and bottom of the structure using vines. Then, I used 9 flat pieces of wood to create a platform, keeping it elevated to avoid the damp ground. For the roof, I tied 2 poles together and placed them horizontally, securing them with vines to form a basic frame. I wove vines across the top, creating a simple net, and covered it with large palm leaves to shield against rain. With that, my basic rainproof shelter was complete. I lay down inside to test it. It wasn't the most comfortable, but it offered some protection from the elements. Exhausted from my efforts, I noticed the sky darkening, so I hurried to start a fire next to my shelter. For dinner, I feasted on the wild fruits I had gathered on the mountain. Sitting cross-legged in my shelter, I stared at the fire while enjoying the bananas. Each night brought a deep sense of vulnerability, and I found myself reflecting on home, my recent experiences, and what lay ahead. With my shelter built, I felt a bit more secure. The island didn't seem as frightening, but I still felt uneasy. My shelter had no walls, and the only thing I could rely on was the crackling fire beside me. I added a few more thick logs to the flames before slowly drifting off to sleep, my mind swirling with thoughts. Chapter 10. Planning. The sound of the waves in the morning is always more vibrant than at night. Today, I woke up early, just as the sun peeked over the horizon. Seagulls were already foraging on the rocks, calling out incessantly, "Ooh, ooh." Sitting bleary-eyed on my bed, I couldn't help but sigh, I'm not even living as well as a seagull. Once I cleared my thoughts, I began to contemplate my plans for the days ahead. This small island is rich in resources. The rocky areas are teeming with seafood, and the mountains are dotted with various wild fruits. During my exploration yesterday afternoon, I had a fruitful haul and even discovered freshwater, which means I can survive here. However, lacking cooking tools means I can't drink boiled water, which makes me anxious, preventing me from drinking too much. Fortunately, the banana heart is full of moisture and can serve as a water source. I believe I should spend more time along the coastline, looking for useful marine debris or materials for making pottery. Additionally, I need to build a secure shelter. I suspect there may be large carnivorous animals on the island, so constructing a sturdy wooden house with a fence seems necessary. These are my priorities. Plans to reach the summit and catch goats can wait for later. For breakfast, I ate the wild fruits I had gathered yesterday and nibbled on a couple of banana hearts before shouldering my backpack and grabbing my axe to explore. This time, my target was the coastline. I was eager to find an iron can to boil water and cook food. Walking from the shelter to the rocky area, I headed south, away from the mountainous region. The beach seemed endless. I walked for 4 hours, from morning until noon, only to find that there wasn't a single piece of marine debris on this small island, not even a plastic bottle. Does this mean my location is exceptionally remote from human activity? If so, my chances of being rescued will greatly diminish. I later realized that it might be due to the tidal effects of the outer terrain preventing debris from drifting here. Feeling quite down, I encountered a channel blocking my path. This channel was about 5 or 6 meters wide and extended deep into the island. With the tide coming in, I couldn't cross. Looking back, I saw that my shelter was no longer visible, indicating that I was circling the island, even though I had only covered less than 1/10 of it. I decided to explore further into the island along the channel, nibbling on a couple of bananas to tide me over. I still had 5 bananas left from yesterday, but the strawberries and cactus fruits were all gone. The channel was long, and the terrain to the south was lower. I wasn't sure if this channel went all the way through the island because it began to curve ahead, obscuring my view. I didn't dare go too deep and decided to head back through the forest. Upon entering the rainforest, I was greeted by a refreshing coolness. The dense foliage blocked the midday sun, and the air was exceptionally fresh, contrary to my expectations of a foreboding atmosphere. The plants were lush and green. I instinctively made my way north, occasionally spotting various insects around me, grasshoppers, colorful mantises, and flower spiders. I noticed yellow squirrels in the trees, small gliding mice, I don't know their scientific name, and even a bright green snake. Every step I took was careful, afraid of stepping on something poisonous. Although I couldn't identify which ones were toxic, the rainforest's creatures were vastly different from those I had encountered before. I had heard that triangular-headed snakes were venomous, but I couldn't distinguish whether their heads were triangular or round. The risks and efforts proved worthwhile when I discovered a patch of bamboo in the forest. Perhaps due to the favorable climate, this bamboo was lush, thick, and deep green. Bamboo has many uses. Looking at the time, it was past 1 in the afternoon, and I still had plenty of time, so I began cutting bamboo. Fresh bamboo is brittle and much easier to chop down than trees. I cut down 20 thick bamboo stalks and another 30 thinner ones, even digging up 2 pieces of bamboo shoots. What a treasure. Fragrant and crunchy. However, I faced another dilemma. How could I transport this bamboo back to my shelter? I could drag at most 3 large bamboo stalks at a time, and moving through this dense forest was cumbersome. I found a bundle of vines and began by dragging out the thin bamboo, bundling 10 pieces together each time. Thus, I spent the entire afternoon dragging a pile of bamboo back to the shelter. It was another exhausting day, and I returned to the shelter after 5 o'clock. On the way, I found a coconut beneath a coconut tree not far from the shelter. This reminded me to keep a distance from coconut trees. If one happens to fall while I'm standing underneath, that would be game over. Fresh coconuts are easier to open than old ones. After chopping a dozen times, I created a very neat opening. Fortunately, the coconut water was clear. If it were cloudy, it's best not to drink it to avoid diarrhea. After drinking the coconut juice, I began to plan the construction of my camp. I intended to use thick logs to build a house, with the wood being about the thickness of a man's thigh, ensuring that the house would be safe and sturdy. I chose this location but needed to stay a bit farther from the rocky area to avoid being struck by falling stones. The house should have 2 ventilated windows and a door that can be closed, as well as a chimney. This project would require significant effort, with just the timber cutting expected to take a month. I planned to surround the house with a fence made of bamboo, leaving a space of 50 meters on all sides. Inside, I could create awnings, lounge chairs, small tables, and a rack to dry food. In the backyard, I intended to transplant some wild fruits from the mountain and try planting them. Of course, all of this was just a beautiful future in my mind. Only by trying it for myself would I understand how difficult it is to accomplish everything alone. But I believe that as long as I work diligently and accomplish a little each day, it can be done within 5 months. In my mind, I constructed a rough framework, marking specific locations on the ground with branches. By the time I finished this, it was already past 7, and only half of the fiery sun remained on the distant horizon. I ate the remaining bananas, smashed open the leftover coconut to eat the flesh, built a fire, and cut a piece of bamboo to use as a pot. Finally, I could drink boiled water. Night fell, and I was still exhausted, but I didn't rush to sleep. Sitting in the shelter by the firelight, I fiddled with a piece of bamboo. During the equipment selection, I had chosen a bundle of thin iron wire, and the 3mm wire was very sturdy. Can you guess what I'm using it for? I wove a long rope from vine fibers, then cut out 3 small pieces of iron wire. I flattened one end with a stone and sharpened the other, thus, 3 fishing hooks were made. I picked a suitable thin bamboo stalk for a fishing rod, tied the woven rope to the tip, and attached my homemade hooks, preparing to go fishing tomorrow.